The ancient Greeks never just told a story for the sake of it, even if it was primarily to explain the existence of some natural phenomenon, like a mountain range, a constellation, or even human behaviours such as jealousy or rage. Each story conveyed a deeper, allegorical import that was meant to improve our understanding of how to make sense of life. Among the most popular stories of ancient Greece was the story of the 12 Labours of Herakles, in the Roman world known as Hercules. Heracles was a demigod, fathered by Zeus, who took the form of a married woman's husband while he was away, in order that he might sleep with her. Upon returning home, and himself sleeping with his wife, both husband and wife realized something was amiss, so they went to a seer who told them that the woman was now pregnant, with twins, one her husband's and one Zeus's. Meanwhile, Zeus's wife Hera became furious at yet another of his infidelities, and in this particular case, since she had told him about a dream that she had, that a child who would be born of the line of Perseus, in this case the mother that Zeus had just impregnated, would save Olympus and do great deeds. She viewed Zeus as having taken advantage of her confidence purely to indulge his lust with that mortal woman. So she cruelly determined to kill the child by preventing the mother from being able to give birth. Fortunately, the pregnant woman's handmaidens managed to trick Hera, and both babies were delivered healthy. This only served to increase her ongoing rage. Hera then sent 2 serpents into the baby's cot one night, but one of the babies strangled the serpents and played with them like toys. It was clear to the parents which one was Zeus's boy, and it also became clear that Hera would stop at nothing to kill him. The child was originally named Alcides, but both parents, recognizing Hera's animosity, were encouraged by the same seer to change the name of the child to Hera's glory, or in the Greek, Heracles, in an attempt to placate the goddess. This failed miserably, as her rage only continued to grow. In time, he grew to become renowned for his strength, his speed and agility. He was indeed faster and more proficient in combat than any other boy in the realm, though he didn't do so well at school. While he was generally kind and good-natured, he also had a very short fuse and an uncontrollable temper. When chastised by his music teacher for his lack of talent, the adolescent Zeus threw him across the room and killed him. It was clear that he had issues with authority, but also an arrogance and a lack of tact that was to cause him much aggravation in the future. On the positive side, he developed patience by learning to hunt, to use a bow and a sword, eventually becoming very skilled at searching out the many monsters plaguing the countryside and slaying them, as well as protecting his adopted city of Thebes from attack by other kings. He was loyal and protective of his human, lesser twin brother, and evoked the same love and loyalty back from him, and many other people too. His growing popularity and power motivated the current king to offer his daughter to Heracles as a wife, and the couple had a number of children, living the idyllic life of a young, well-to-do family. One day, Heracles came home from a long day slaying monsters, as usual, but saw several demons standing on the porch of his home, whom he attacked and strangled instantly. Then, suddenly, a dragon came screaming out of his house towards him, so he killed it as well. Suddenly, to his horror, the dead monsters transformed into his wife and children, as the spell of delusion Hera cast upon him wore off. The people were horrified, as murdering family was the greatest crime that could be committed in ancient Greece. Few people were convinced that it was a spell by Hera, as it had been some time since she had tried to kill him. Even so, the ancient Greek legal system didn't factor in temporary insanity. The individual was still held entirely responsible for a crime. Grief-stricken and suicidal, he knew that if he killed himself, he would never face them again in the underworld, and that the only way he could remedy this was to exile himself and atone for his sins first. In ancient Greece, only priests or anointed kings had the power to expiate sin, and this usually involved a significant penance or servitude. It's worth pointing out that the difference between penance and punishment in ancient Greece was that punishment was not enough. To receive absolution, one had to perform voluntary acts of penance, in other words, doing acts of good or service, in order to compensate society for the crime. It seems a much better idea than just being separated from society for a set period, in the hope that this would somehow be enough to transform the offender into a better person. Punishment without penance seems to be a far less effective method at transforming a criminal into a better person. So Heracles set out to visit the oracle of Delphi to ask for guidance. Unfortunately, Hera had also possessed the oracle and now told him that he would need to serve as a slave to his estranged cousin, who himself was a favourite of Hera, for at least 10 years, serving patiently, without complaint or refusal, after which he would have his sins expiated and become immortal. It was her goal to humiliate and kill him. Heracles was reluctant to be the slave of someone he deemed so inferior, but eventually he relented and submitted to the sentence. His cousin, the king of Tiryns, was jealous, deceitful, and resentful of Heracles' power, popularity, and ability, so he set out to give Heracles tasks that were meant to be fatal or impossible. The Labours of Herakles. Labour 1. Killing the Nemean lion. This rampaging lion had killed many people and terrorized a number of towns. It was not the first lion Heracles had fought, but it was the most ferocious Titan offspring, and it was impervious to weapons. Nothing but brute strength would kill it. A cat, being itself arrogant, untamable, and unpredictably violent, was a fitting first monster for Heracles to be tasked with subduing, being a symbolic representation of his own inflated sense of self-importance. But if it was overcome, many people would benefit. He had to strangle the lion with his bare hands in a display of pure physical power, but it took him many months to prepare himself through training his arms by uprooting trees with his bare hands and smashing rocks. He felt great respect for the lion, as he did for all of his other future foes, and always acknowledged their power and worthiness as opponents. Killing the Nemean lion was to prove his most defining act, because he skinned it and wore its indestructible pelt as an ongoing symbol of his real identity. It's interesting that he himself, being rather thin-skinned and prone to easily losing his temper, would, as it were, put on the indestructibly tough skin of another animal, famous for its strength. Labour 2. Killing the Hydra. The Hydra was a multi-headed serpent monster that lived in the lake of Lerna, guarding one of the entrances to the underworld. It spat lethal poison, and if decapitated, grew 2 new heads for every one you cut off. It seemed an impossible task. To make matters worse, unbeknownst to Hercules, Hera had placed one of her favourite monsters, a giant crab, in the lake, waiting for a surprise attack on Hercules when he least expected it. Having cut off a few heads, only to see more sprout out, and suddenly dodging an attack by the crab from below, he retreated to think about how best to win, given the unfair addition of an extra monster, which was now part of the deal. Heracles' nephew tracked him down and offered to help, by cauterizing the wounded necks of the Hydra before a new head could grow. Heracles thought it was only fair that he could use help, since there were now 2 monsters. Together they managed to kill the Hydra, while Heracles crushed the crab with his club. Heracles also had the foresight to dip all his arrows into the blood of the Hydra, thinking the poison might come in handy in some future battle. Labour 3. Capturing the Golden Hind. The Golden Hind of Serenea was the fastest animal on earth, faster than a shot arrow, and so impossible to chase. It wasn't dangerous, but because it was sacred to the goddess Artemis, capturing it would ensure the Olympian goddess's wrath, and she would kill you for sure. So this task was given to Hercules as a damned if you do and damned if you don't scenario. If he failed to capture the hind, he would fail in his penance. If he did capture it, Artemis would kill him. After almost a year of stalking the deer, Heracles managed to trap it in a net. He was very gentle and careful not to hurt it, but as he made his return, he was confronted by Artemis and her twin brother Apollo. About to shoot him, Heracles bowed on his knees, explaining his dilemma, and swore that he would release the hind as soon as his task was acknowledged. Now, normally, Artemis would have killed anyone for daring to touch her sacred animal, regardless of their story. But because Hera was the party responsible for this whole situation, and because Hera also gave both Artemis and Apollo a hard time, being their evil stepmother, so to speak, it pleased Artemis and Apollo to help Heracles fulfill his mission, just to stick it to Hera. Having brought the hind to court, as Heracles passed the animal over to the king, he pinched it, causing the animal to buck and escape. That way, he fulfilled his promise to Artemis and prevented the animal becoming the king's captive pet. Labour 4. Capturing the Erymanthian boar. The next year of labour saw a demand placed on Heracles to capture a famously vicious wild boar and bring it back alive and unharmed to the court. Boars are famous for their impossibility to tame, so it was expected that Heracles would fail to subdue this beast. In preparation, Heracles decided to visit his wise friend, the centaur Pholus, for advice on how to capture it. He was told to wait for winter, when the snow cover would help him track and corner the boar. Meanwhile, he was invited to stay and enjoy the centaur's hospitality. Centaurs were notoriously violent alcoholics, and one night a whole host of centaurs visited them, and everybody, including Heracles, having got riotously drunk, fell into an all-out brawl that escalated into outright slaughter, as Heracles bashed and shot with his poison arrows almost every centaur to death, even accidentally dropping a poisoned arrow onto his host Pholus's foot, causing his death. Few centaurs escaped alive, and one of them, Nessus, swore revenge on Heracles that would eventually succeed where even Hera had failed. Heracles was remorseful and saddened at his loss of self-control and resulting carnage. He helped bury the dead before resuming his hunt for the boar, which, as advised, was successful in the winter snow. He brought the exhausted and subdued animal back to court and handed over the wild beast to the king, who fearfully jumped into an empty wine vessel, to his great humiliation. Labour 5. Cleaning the Augean stables. The next task Heracles was given was not dangerous, but was meant to be impossible. If he failed to complete it, he would be doomed to never expiate his sins, and so never see his family in the afterlife. King Augeas of Elis was the son of Helios, the sun god. He had several thousand head of golden cattle that were immortal. They lived in a stable that had not been cleaned in 30 years, and, being magical, they produced significantly more dung than normal cattle. Heracles was tasked to clean out 30 years of accumulated, enchanted poo in just one day. Seeing the magnificent herd and being a steak lover, Heracles tried to negotiate with King Augeas to keep 10% of the herd for himself if he managed to complete the impossible task. Thinking it unlikely, the king agreed. Realising that shoveling so much manure was impossible to do in so short a time, instead Heracles uprooted a few trees, using skills he was already good at, and used them to plough a new watercourse, diverting 2 rivers straight through the stables and flushing the manure into the fields of the countryside of Elis, to the great appreciation and joy of the local farming community. When he approached the king for his reward, he denied any such agreement and insisted on the free labour as terms of his servitude, reporting Heracles to King Eurystheus. A furious Heracles swore to make the king pay, which he eventually did, but for now he left empty-handed, and expecting to have this entire labour disqualified for trying to score a side profit. By now, Heracles had accomplished several legendary feats, killed a number of vicious monsters, making the countryside safe for ordinary people. He had also fertilised the fields of a whole region, improving its agriculture and gradually renewing his reputation as a hero amongst the ordinary people. He also began drawing the respect and admiration of several of the Olympian gods for his abilities and uncomplaining perseverance throughout impossibly difficult circumstances. Labour 6. The Stymphalian Bird Menace. The next labour would have been impossible without the credibility and sympathy Heracles had built up with a number of the other Olympian gods. King Eurystheus decided once again to give him an impossible task, that of ridding the region of Arcadia of the man-eating bird monsters around Lake Stymphalios. These birds had beaks of iron and talons of brass, and their droppings were so toxic that the land they fell upon became a swampy wasteland. Heracles found it impossible to wade through the toxic swamp to get close enough to the birds, so the goddess Athena, seeing his dilemma, gave him a rattle, forged by the god Hephaestus, that was so loud it frightened the birds into the air. This gave Heracles a clear shot with his bow and poison arrows, and he killed so many of them that the few remaining ones flew away, allowing the land to be renewed, safe and livable again. Gods were not just beginning to notice, but they were actively cheering for him, as well as providing him with useful gifts to use in his battles. Labour 7. Capturing the Cretan bull. Turning once again to a dangerous feat, Heracles was tasked with capturing alive the Cretan bull and bringing it back to the king as a prize. The bull, created by Poseidon as a symbol of his affirmation of the rule of King Minos of Crete, was supposed to have been sacrificed in gratitude as an offering back to Poseidon after it emerged from the sea. But the king, and especially the queen, became so entranced by its magnificence that they decided to keep the bull for themselves. Infuriated by this lack of respect, Poseidon made the bull go mad, and it began tearing up the countryside, causing mayhem and destruction. Heracles was sent to Crete as a favour of one king to another, to rid King Minos of the menace, or even better, gore our hero to death. In the direct and purposeful manner that he had become famous for, Heracles walked right up to it and tackled the bull head-on, taking the full brunt of its charge and hanging onto its horns, while wrestling and punching it until the bull was exhausted and tamed into submission. He then rode the bull across the sea back to the Peloponnese, and entering the royal court, the king, again terrified, dived into an empty wine jug to hide. Having satisfied his duty, with the king too terrified to take over control of the animal, Heracles released the bull, which again went mad, running all over Greece and terrifying the population of the eastern lands. The bull was no longer Heracles' responsibility, and another hero was destined to once again bring it to heel, in a later story. Labour 8. Harnessing the Diomedian mares. Heracles was next told to go into Thrace, to the kingdom ruled by the giant Diomedes, son of Ares, the god of war. He was famous for his 4 fabulous horses. Heracles was tasked with stealing these horses and bringing them as a trophy back to King Eurystheus. Unbeknownst to Hercules, the horses were wild and savage, the result of being fed a diet of human flesh by Diomedes. They were also said to breathe fire. It was hoped that Heracles would blunder into their stable and be devoured by them, or otherwise be killed by the giant in the act of stealing them. Instead, Heracles left a companion to keep an eye on the horses while he went off to negotiate with the king for their release. Stealing was just not his style. Of course, the tyrant king would have none of it, and a fight ensued, in which Diomedes was killed. Upon returning to the stables, Heracles saw that his companion had got too close to the horses, so they bit and dragged him into their stable, devouring him in minutes. Enraged, Heracles threw the body of the giant to the horses as well, and having eaten their master, the bitter taste of his flesh seemed to neutralize their fury, and they became permanently calm and compliant. He hitched them to a chariot and rode back to King Eurystheus, who dedicated the horses to the goddess Hera and bred them into his own stables. It's said that Alexander the Great's horse Bucephalus descended from this line. Labour 9. The Girdle of Hippolyta. The next labour was a gift the king bestowed on his daughter, who, like many little girls, were awed by tales of the fierce Amazonian women warriors. She demanded that Heracles travel to their land and bring back the jewelled girdle of the Amazon queen Hippolyta that was made for her by the god Ares himself. When Heracles and his crew sailed to the land of the Amazons, they were expecting to have to fight their way to victory, given the Amazons' ferocious reputation as warriors, as well as their legendary hatred of men, but instead they found a warm welcome and were garlanded by flowers. The Amazons were well aware of Heracles' heroic reputation and respected him for the strength, dignity and perseverance he showed despite the many obstacles and suicidal missions he was sent on. Such was the admiration that the Amazon queen held for him that she gave him the bejewelled girdle without any hesitation. Heracles himself began to fall in love with this tough and exotic woman. This out-of-character behaviour of the Amazons so infuriated the goddess Hera that she decided to wreak havoc by whispering paranoid ideas into the heads of all the other women warriors throughout the camp. They soon began to attack and murder Heracles' crew members, and when he became alerted to the chaos, flew into a rage, killing Hippolyta for her presumed treachery and escaping with his men back to Greece, never suspecting that they, like himself all those years ago, was duped by Hera. Labour 10. Rustling the cattle of Geryon. The 10th task involved a number of challenges, any of which could hopefully be fatal to Heracles. He was to make his way out to the western edge of the known world, to an island that was reputed to have a fabulous herd of red cattle. The king demanded he rustle and drive the entire herd back to the royal court for the king's own pleasure. And by the way, the island belonged to a fierce, three-headed titan called Geryon, who guarded the cattle with the help of a ferocious, club-wielding giant called Eurytion, as well as the two-headed dog monster Orthrus, brother of Cerberus, the guardian dog monster of the underworld. So Heracles set off on the long walk to the west, and as he was walking through the Libyan desert, the heat of the sun was so strong that he yelled up at the Titan sun god Helios to back off with the roasting, or he'd shoot him down with his arrows. By now, Heracles' fame as an archer and the deadliness of his poison arrows was so great that even gods trembled at the thought of being shot. So Helios relented with the heat and even sent down a huge cup-shaped boat for Heracles to sail down towards the west, shortening his journey considerably. It's worth pausing for a moment to consider the total lack of fear or intimidation Heracles felt by anyone. In some sense, his arrogance was breathtaking. in the way he considered himself equal to any god or monster. But on a psychological level, we can also view this as a can-do mindset, where no task is viewed as beyond your achievement, if you have complete belief in yourself. In Heracles' case, each victory made him more competent, more confident, and more emboldened. He just went for it, and devil take the consequences. Washing up onto the beach of the island, Heracles was met by the charging giant, who he dispatched easily with an arrow through the throat. He then took care of the dog, easily crushing one head, then the other with his club. Barely breaking a sweat, the three-headed Geryon then charged at him, but received an arrow into his belly for his trouble, the acid poison working its way up his body, and each head screaming in agony, then falling dead at Heracles' feet. Ferrying the cattle across to Spain, Heracles marked his visit to the edge of the goal. Eventually, Heracles made it back to court, excited at having completed his 10th and, in his mind, final labour. Cattle up through Spain, along the Mediterranean coast, down through Dalmatia and into Greece, all the while struggling to keep the herd together as Hera sent swarms of flies and other pests to scatter and panic the cattle in an attempt to sabotage his. Unfortunately for our hero, his excitement at finishing his 10 years of servitude was quickly spoiled when he was told, to his dismay, that he would be required to spend an additional 2 years in for the disqualifications of his Hydra and Augean stable shenanigans. He was disqualified for his Hydra task because he had assistance, which was against the rules, and he was disqualified for his Augean stables task for trying to negotiate personal gain. Since the stakes were so high, he managed for once to keep calm and control his rage, knowing that he was too close now to the end to fail. Labour 11. The Golden Apples of the Hesperides. The challenge of this task, finding the garden of the Hesperides and picking some golden apples from the tree, was not in itself a terribly dangerous task. A monstrous snake guarded the tree, no big deal for our hero, but the challenge was in that nobody knew where the garden was, and moreover, only a god could pick the apples. So it was a serious challenge of addressing the unknowns. Unknowns usually represent the subconscious, and often take the form of sea or forest creatures and caves in ancient myths. Not knowing where to start his search, Heracles wandered around the world asking for advice, eventually making his way to the far north of Europe, where some river nymphs suggested that he seek out the Old Man of the Sea, a water titan named Nereus, who knew everything and would certainly be able to help. He eventually tracked him down and had to wrestle the shape-shifting god into submission before he finally agreed to help. In typical vague fashion, the advisor told him that he would have to circumnavigate the entire Mediterranean until someone called to him from a high place. You would have to help them, and they would in turn help you. It wasn't much, but at least it gave him a direction to travel in, and along the way, Heracles wrestled some giants, killed some monsters, and deposed a few dictators, till eventually he came upon a mountain, upon which Prometheus was chained. Prometheus was the titan that gave mankind the knowledge of fire, and for his insolence, Zeus had sentenced him to have his liver eaten every day by an eagle in a gruesome Groundhog Day scenario for all eternity. Prometheus called out to Heracles, and Heracles, having no particular concerns about overriding what he thought was an unjust sentence, smashed the chains with his club, freeing the enslaved titan. Grateful, Prometheus directed him to head to the far west once again and seek the aid of the titan Atlas, himself sentenced to an eternity of punishment by holding up the world on his shoulders. So off he went and eventually came upon the garden. Creeping over the wall, Heracles shot the guardian serpent but was unable to pick the fruit, as though they were holograms. Dispirited, he took a walk and came across Atlas nearby, who offered to help, as he was a god and could pick the apples for him. Heracles naively offered to hold up the world for him while he did so, and Atlas soon came back with a basket full of golden apples, and a serious urge to leave Heracles there holding the world in his place. In a rare example of craftiness, Heracles told him he was more than happy to give Atlas a bit of a holiday, but asked him to help just adjust the world onto his shoulders a little more comfortably. Then, as Atlas got close, he quickly dumped it back onto him. It seems that Heracles wasn't such a dull-witted jock after all. Returning to court with the basket of apples, the disappointed king knew he couldn't keep them, or Hera and Athena would punish him, so they were given to the local priestesses, who presumably returned them via a divine courier system. Labour 12. Retrieving Cerberus. The final labour of Heracles was definitely supposed to be impossible, and the last chance for King Eurystheus to doom him. He demanded that Heracles go into the underworld, itself impossible for mortals, and bring back the three-headed guardian dog Cerberus. The king was betting on Heracles' destruction for daring to be sacrilegious enough to enter the realm of Hades. Obviously, our hero thought nothing of it. No boundary was going to hold him from his mission, divine or mortal. Philosophers have long argued whether this was a positive or negative character trait, and as we consider the careers of our own ambitious leaders, soldiers, artists and heroes all throughout history, we might still wonder the same thing today. Nevertheless, Heracles thought it might make the confrontation with Hades less uncomfortable if he was at least initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries, which was presided over by Persephone, the wife of Hades. Hopefully, it would make him a member of the club, so to speak. So Heracles made his way towards the entrance of the underworld, where he was met by the god Hermes and the goddess Athena, who offered to accompany and assist him. Together, they travelled through winding caverns, encountering many ghosts of the dead, until they eventually made it to the throne room. Hades was incensed that Heracles would dare take his pet dog back to the surface, but when he explained that Hades' sister-in-law, Hera, wanted Heracles to fail, Hades began to warm to the idea, as he, along with many other gods, didn't think much of Hera and actually would enjoy souring her plans. But first, Heracles needed to subdue Cerberus, and then make sure he returned him unharmed afterwards. After a significant wrestle, with Heracles' lion skin protecting him from the bites and venomous stings of Cerberus, the dog eventually tired out and submitted, like a good dog, to the new alpha male. Heracles picked up the exhausted pup and carried him gently on his shoulders up to the surface. When he arrived back at court, Cerberus happily bounding by his side, the terrified king once again jumped into his wine jar and hastily absolved Heracles of all his sins and set him free of his servitude. Heracles, seemingly no less impetuous, ambitious, or wise, embarked on a pent-up vendetta against all the kings, tyrants, and supporters that had ever double-crossed him or refused to assist him over the years. On occasion, he would be punished with servitude, just like the first time. In the end, he found love again, remarried, and was happy, for a time, till his wandering eye began to cause marital stress, and again, as before, his happiness was cut short when the very centaur Nessus that escaped the cave battle all those years ago tried to molest his wife while ferrying her across a river. Heracles shot him from across the bank, but the dying centaur tricked Heracles' wife into believing that his shirt, now bloodied and stained with Hydra poison, was enchanted and would make Heracles love only her if she could convince him to wear it. Naively, she took the shirt and later gifted it to Heracles, who, having put it on, began screaming in agony as the Hydra's poison scorched his skin, causing him to die a slow and horrific death. It seems that whenever Heracles found a little happiness, it was taken away from him. Indeed, a happy husband and wife ending almost never happens in the Greek myths. Anyway, Zeus, heartbroken at such a heroic yet tragic life, revived and immortalized Heracles and gave him pride of place as protector of Olympus, which proved to be just as well because a war with the Titans was brewing. In the ensuing battle, Heracles almost single-handedly saved Hera from rape and death by wave after wave of murderous Titans, hell-bent on humiliating her. Finally, seeing him so steadfastly doing his duty after all the evil that she had done to him, Hera finally saw him as the hero he truly was and accepted Heracles as her own personal champion. In many respects, Heracles could be viewed as quite the megalomaniac and sociopath. Despite his many personal trials and tragedies, he became no less prone to bouts of rage and violence as the years went by, or having done his penance. However, his uncontrollable rage always resulted in deep bouts of depression and remorse. In this sense, he was childish in his thoughtless overreactions, lack of self-control, and oversensitivity to criticism. But we should also look at him as being childlike in his genuine regret and shame for doing wrong, his directness and lack of guile, his persistence, sympathy for others, and willingness to help. He was in some respects an amplified, even caricatured version of all of us. His dark side was disturbingly dark, but his noble qualities were impossibly luminous. Most of all, he earns our respect for his limitless fortitude in accepting and enduring long years of suffering and continuous persecution by powers and circumstances well beyond his control, without ever cursing his fate or himself for being born into the life he had. Even the greatest of heroes is fated to suffer disaster and anguish on a regular basis throughout their lives. What makes them a hero is their audacity to get up every time they're down, their single-minded determination to succeed despite the odds, and the perseverance to do their duty, even under the most unbearable persecution. And in the end, that's the best that any of us can do.